The children slept in their beds, their breathing soft and even in the summer darkness. Below in the parlour, the older girls whispered and laughed, their voices carrying through the wooden floors of the modest white house on 2nd Street. It was the 10th of June, 1912, and Villisca, Iowa, lay wrapped in the kind of stillness that small towns wear like a second skin. The Presbyterian church social had ended hours before. The dishes had been washed. The doors had been locked. In every room, the occupants of the Moore household had surrendered to sleep, unaware that someone moved through the darkness of their home with purpose and silence. The axe had been taken from the chopping block in the yard. The blade caught no moonlight as it was carried up the narrow stairs. No dog barked. No floorboard creaked loudly enough to wake the dreaming. The killer stood in the doorway of the first bedroom, watching the rise and fall of breathing chests, listening to the gentle sounds of a family at rest. Outside, the locusts sang their summer song. Inside, time held its breath. And in that moment between midnight and dawn, the boundary between the ordinary world and horror grew thin as parchment. The first blow fell without warning, then the second, then the third. The house on 2nd Street would never know peace again. Chapter 1. The Children's Day. Good evening, and welcome to the Bedside Historian. The night is quiet now, and the world has grown small around you. Wherever you are listening from, whatever hour marks your clock, let us drift backward together through the years. Let the present fade. Let the darkness become a doorway. Tonight, we travel to the heartland of America, to a time when small towns lived by the rhythm of church bells and train whistles, when neighbours knew one another's names and children played freely in dusty streets. We go to Iowa in the summer of 1912, to a place called Villisca, where 8 souls went to sleep one June night and never woke to see the morning. This is their story. Please, if you have not already subscribed to this channel, let us begin. The 10th of June, 1912 dawned warm and clear over the fields surrounding Villisca, Iowa. The town, home to some 2,000 souls, sat in the southwestern corner of the state, a collection of modest homes and sturdy buildings arranged along a grid of unpaved streets. Montgomery County farmland stretched in every direction, corn and hay growing green under the summer sun. The town had what it needed: churches, schools, a bank, a hardware store, general merchants, and the constant presence of the railroad that connected this small place to the wider world. Life moved at the pace of the seasons. Men worked the land or tended business in town. Women kept house and raised children. Families gathered on Sundays. The rhythms were known and comfortable. Josiah Moore rose early that morning, as was his custom. He was 43 years old, a respected businessman in Villisca, partner in the Moore and Jones Implement Company, which sold farm machinery to the surrounding countryside. He was a man of some standing in the community, a devoted member of the Presbyterian Church, a father to 4 children. His wife Sarah was 42, a woman known for her kindness and her capable management of their home at 408 2nd Street. The house was modest but comfortable, painted white with dark shutters, 2 stories tall with a front porch and a small yard above. It stood on the east side of the street, ordinary in every way, indistinguishable from the other homes that lined the quiet residential block. The Moore children had been anticipating this day for weeks. The Presbyterian Church was holding its annual Children's Day program, an evening of performances and recitations that allowed the young people of the congregation to display what they had learned and rehearsed. Herman, the eldest Moore child at 11 years, had his part memorized. Catherine, aged 10, and Boyd, aged 7, had practiced their pieces until they could recite them without faltering. Little Paul, not quite 5 years old, would watch from the audience with his parents. The family took their faith seriously. They attended services faithfully. The church formed the centre of their social world, as it did for most families in Villisca. Catherine Moore had asked permission to invite friends to stay overnight after the programme. Sarah Moore had agreed. 2 young girls, Lena and Ina Stillinger, would come home with the Moores after the evening's events. Lena was 12, Ina was 8. They were the daughters of Joseph and Sarah Stillinger, who lived a few blocks away on West 4th Street. The Stillingers were known to the Moores through church, and through the ordinary intersections of small-town life. The girls were excited at the prospect of spending the night away from home, of sleeping in the Moore house with Catherine, of staying up late whispering in the darkness as young girls do. The day passed in ordinary fashion. Josiah attended to business matters. Sarah prepared the house and oversaw her children. The afternoon grew warm. Villisca drowsed in the June heat. At around 7 o'clock in the evening, as the worst of the day's warmth began to fade, families across town prepared to walk to the Presbyterian Church for the Children's Day program. The church stood at 4th and Main, a solid brick building with a tall steeple visible from anywhere in town. Its sanctuary could hold 300 people when filled. The Moore family walked together to the church. Catherine's friends, Lena and Ina Stillinger, met them there, having come with their own parents. The church filled with townspeople. Farmers who had finished their evening chores came in from the surrounding countryside. Merchants closed their shops and walked with their families to the service. The sanctuary grew warm with the press of bodies. Women fanned themselves with folded papers. Children fidgeted in the pews until their mothers gave them warning looks. The program began promptly at 8 o'clock. Children rose one by one or in small groups to recite verses, sing songs, and perform the small dramas they had rehearsed under the direction of the church elders. Herman Moore delivered his recitation without error. Catherine spoke her piece with careful precision. Boyd remembered every word assigned to him. The audience applauded after each performance. Parents beamed with pride. The evening proceeded as such evenings always did, wholesome and predictable, a celebration of innocence and community values. Among those in attendance was a travelling minister named George Kelly. He was not from Villisca. He had arrived in town only days before, an itinerant preacher who moved from place to place offering his services to churches that would receive him. He had asked permission to attend the Children's Day program and had been welcomed, as strangers often were in small towns where Christian charity demanded hospitality. He sat among the congregation, watching the children perform, his presence noted but not questioned. Villisca was accustomed to occasional visitors. The railroad brought drummers, salesmen, and preachers through town with some regularity. Also present was Frank Jones, a wealthy businessman who had once been Josiah Moore's employer. There had been difficulties between the two men. Josiah had left Jones's employment to start his own implement business in partnership with another man. Jones was said to harbour resentment over this departure. He was a state senator, a man of influence and temper. His presence at the church that evening was unremarkable. He belonged to the congregation. But later, when horror descended upon the Moore household, some would remember that he had been there, had seen the family together, had known they would return home that night. The programme concluded at approximately 9:30. The congregation rose and began to make their way out into the summer darkness. Families clustered on the church steps, exchanging pleasantries, making plans for the week ahead. The Moore family gathered their children. Lena and Ina Stillinger said goodnight to their parents and joined the Moores for the walk home. Sarah Moore spoke briefly with neighbours. Josiah shook hands with several men. The night was pleasant, still warm but no longer oppressive. A light breeze moved through the streets. The walk from the church to the Moore house took perhaps 10 minutes. The family moved together through the quiet streets. Few houses showed lights in their windows. Most of Villisca had already retired for the evening or would do so soon. Farm families rose early. Shopkeepers needed their rest. The town kept early hours. By 10 o'clock, 2nd Street lay mostly dark and silent. The Moore house stood waiting. Josiah unlocked the front door and the family entered. Sarah lit lamps in the downstairs rooms. The children were excited. The Stillinger girls particularly so, thrilled by the adventure of sleeping away from home. Sarah directed them toward the kitchen, where she had prepared a cold supper. The evening had been long, and the children were hungry despite the late hour. They sat at the kitchen table eating bread and milk while the adults moved through the house preparing for sleep. The house was not large. Downstairs held a parlour, a sitting room, a dining room, and a kitchen. A narrow staircase led to the 2nd floor where 4 bedrooms opened off a central hallway. Josiah and Sarah's room was at the southeast corner of the house. Herman and Boyd shared a room at the southwest corner. Catherine would sleep in the northwest bedroom, and little Paul occupied the smallest bedroom at the northeast corner. The Stillinger girls would share the bed in Catherine's room, a treat for all three girls who looked forward to the whispered conversations in the darkness. Sarah Moore moved through the downstairs rooms, extinguishing lamps, checking that doors were secured. The back door she would later be remembered to have checked carefully. The front door Josiah had locked when they entered. The house grew dark room by room. Upstairs, the children changed into their nightclothes. The Stillinger girls had brought nothing with them, so Catherine lent them nightgowns. They climbed into the bed together, three young girls settling beneath the covers, their voices soft in the darkness. Josiah Moore made his final rounds through the house. He was a careful man, methodical in his habits. He checked the doors once more. He looked out the windows at the quiet street. Nothing moved in the darkness. Villisca slept. He climbed the stairs to the second floor and entered the bedroom he shared with his wife. Sarah was already in bed. The house fell silent except for the settling sounds that old wooden structures make in the night, the creaks and whispers of timber and nails adjusting to temperature and weight. In the children's bedrooms, sleep came quickly. The evening had been long and exciting. Herman and Boyd lay still in their shared bed. Little Paul curled small in his room. In Catherine's room, the three girls eventually stopped their whispered talk and drifted into sleep, their breathing becoming deep and regular. Josiah and Sarah Moore lay in their bed, perhaps speaking briefly to one another about the evening's events, about the children's performances, about the ordinary matters of their lives. Then they too surrendered to sleep. The house on 2nd Street stood dark and quiet. All the 8 souls within its walls slept peacefully. The night was warm. A slight breeze moved through the town, the locusts sang in the trees. The stars wheeled slowly overhead in their ancient patterns, and somewhere in the darkness, someone moved with purpose toward the white house on 2nd Street, carrying an axe. Chapter 2. The House on 2nd Street. Midnight passed. The town of Villisca lay wrapped in the deep silence that settles over rural places in the small hours. No automobiles moved through the streets. Few families in town owned such machines. The occasional sound of a passing train might disturb the night, but 2nd Street was far enough from the tracks that even those distant rumbles barely registered. Dogs sometimes barked at shadows or passing animals. Otherwise, nothing broke the stillness. The Moore house stood among its neighbours, a structure of wood and nails and ordinary materials, built to shelter a family from the elements and provide them with the modest comforts that respectable people in a small Iowa town expected. The foundation was stone. The walls were clapboard or painted white. The roof was shingled. The windows were double-hung, the kind that could be raised or lowered to allow air circulation in the summer heat. Several of these windows had been left open to catch any breeze that might relieve the warmth of the June night. Inside, 8 people slept. In the southeast bedroom on the 2nd floor, Josiah Moore lay on his side of the bed, Sarah on hers. They had been married for many years. They knew each other's sleeping habits, the way married people do. They did not crowd each other. Each had their space in the bed they shared. Their bedroom was furnished simply. A dresser stood against one wall. A washstand held a basin and pitcher. Their clothing hung in a small closet or was folded in drawers. Everything was neat and ordered, as Sarah kept all the rooms of her house. Across the hall in the southwest bedroom, Herman and Boyd Moore shared a bed, as brothers often did in that era, when houses were smaller and families larger. Herman, at 11, was beginning to stretch into the height he would have reached had he been given more years. Boyd, at 7, was still small, his body that of a young child. They slept soundly after the excitement of the evening's programme. Boys that age sleep deeply, their bodies exhausted by constant motion and growth. In the smallest bedroom at the northeast corner, little Paul Moore lay in his bed, not quite 5 years old. He was the baby of the family, doted upon by his older siblings and parents alike. His room was barely large enough for the small bed and a few pieces of furniture. He slept with the absolute stillness of very young children, their sleep so profound that they seem almost not to breathe. In the northwest bedroom, Catherine Moore and the Stillinger sisters had finally ceased their whispering and had fallen asleep. 3 girls in one bed, their hair spread across the pillows, their faces peaceful in sleep. Catherine was 10, at that age when girls begin to leave childhood behind but have not yet reached the complications of adolescence. Lena Stillinger, 12, was the older of the 2 sisters, responsible and careful. Ina, 8, was bright and cheerful, quick to laugh. They had been so pleased to be allowed to stay the night at the Moore house. It had seemed like an adventure, a break from routine, a special privilege. The house breathed around them. Old wood expands and contracts with temperature changes. Foundations settle, floors creak. These are normal sounds, the language of buildings. Anyone who has lived in an old house knows these noises and learns not to wake at them. They become part of the background of sleep, no more disturbing than the sound of wind in trees or rain on roofs. But sometime after midnight, another sound entered the house. The back door, which Sarah Moore had checked before retiring, was pushed open. Later, much later, when investigators tried to reconstruct the events of that night, they would theorize about this entry. The door had been locked. Sarah Moore was certain of it, yet the lock was a simple one, the kind that could be manipulated with basic tools or even a stiff piece of wire. Or perhaps a window had been used instead. Several were open to the night air. A person could remove a screen without great difficulty and climb through. However entry was gained, someone was inside the house. This person moved through the downstairs rooms in complete darkness. The lamps had all been extinguished hours before, yet whoever had entered seemed to know the layout of the house. They did not stumble over furniture or knock into walls. They moved with certainty, as if they had been inside the Moore house before, as if they knew exactly where each room lay and what it contained. In the yard behind the house stood a chopping block where wood was split for the kitchen stove. Leaning against the small outbuilding used for storing tools was an axe. It was not a particularly fine tool. The handle was worn from use. The blade needed sharpening. But it was heavy enough to split wood, and it would serve for other purposes as well. At some point, either before entering the house or after gaining entry, the intruder took this axe from its place by the shed. The stairs leading to the second floor were narrow and steep, as they often were in the houses of that period. Each step could betray a person's presence with a creak. Yet whoever climbed those stairs did so without waking anyone in the house. They moved slowly perhaps, placing their feet with care, distributing their weight to minimize sound. Or perhaps they simply benefited from the deep sleep of the innocent. People who had no reason to lie awake listening for danger in a town where violence was almost unknown. At the top of the stairs, the intruder stood in the hallway. 4 bedroom doors opened off this central space. In each room people slept. The intruder could hear them breathing. The sounds of sleep are distinctive. The soft inhalations and exhalations, the occasional shift of position, the rustle of bedclothes. All of these sounds would have been audible in the darkness to someone standing still and listening. A choice was made. The intruder moved towards the southeast bedroom where Josiah and Sarah Moore lay sleeping. The door was pushed open. Moonlight or starlight coming through this window would have provided enough illumination to make out the shapes of furniture, the form of the bed, the 2 people lying there. The axe was raised, and then it fell. The first blow struck Josiah Moore on the head as he slept. The impact was devastating. The human skull, for all its strength, cannot withstand such force. Bone shattered. Josiah likely died instantly or within seconds, his brain destroyed before he could fully wake or comprehend what was happening. Sarah Moore, lying beside her husband, may have stirred at the sound or the motion. She may have begun to wake. She was struck as well, multiple times, the axe rising and falling with terrible purpose. The violence in that bedroom was extreme. Both Josiah and Sarah Moore received numerous blows to the head. The force of the impacts drove bone fragments into brain tissue. Blood spread across the pillows, the bedding, the headboard. The killer worked in darkness, striking again and again, even after both victims were certainly dead. There was a frenzy to it, or perhaps a determination to ensure that neither would survive to identify their attacker. When the killer finished in the master bedroom, they moved to the next room. The pattern repeated. Herman and Boyd Moore were struck as they slept. The axe brought down upon their heads with the same devastating force. The boys would have had no chance to defend themselves, no opportunity to cry out or flee. They simply ceased to exist. Their lives ended before they could transition from sleep to waking. Little Paul in his small bedroom was next. A child not yet 5 years old, sleeping alone in the darkness. The axe fell upon him as it had upon his brothers and parents. His small skull offered even less resistance than those of the adults. The killer showed no mercy, no hesitation. The child died in his bed. Finally, the killer entered the northwest bedroom where 3 girls lay sleeping together. Catherine Moore and Lena and Ina Stillinger had been granted a few more minutes of life simply by virtue of which bedroom they occupied. But now the axe found them as well. Each girl received multiple blows to the head. The violence was as extreme here as it had been in the other bedrooms. The killer ensured that no one survived. When the killing was finished, the intruder did not immediately leave. Instead, they moved through the house, performing a series of strange actions. In the downstairs rooms, clothing was gathered and used to cover windows, fabric was draped over mirrors. In the bedrooms, bedclothes were pulled up over the faces of the dead. In the Stillinger girls' room, where their nightgowns had been pulled up or disturbed during the attack, fabric was carefully arranged to cover their bodies. These actions suggested something beyond simple murder. They implied ritual or shame, or some psychological need on the part of the killer that defied easy explanation. A bowl of bloody water was found in the kitchen, suggesting the killer had attempted to wash. Cigarette butts were discovered, indicating the intruder had remained in the house for some time, perhaps sitting in the darkness among the dead, smoking and thinking whatever thoughts move through the mind of someone capable of such acts. Eventually bored, the killer left the house, the same back door through which they had entered, or a window or the front door. They left behind the axe, which was found in the guest bedroom where the Stillinger girls lay dead. They left behind a scene of such horror that those who would discover it would struggle for the rest of their lives to understand what they had witnessed. The house on 2nd Street stood quiet as dawn approached. Inside, 8 people lay murdered in their beds. Outside, Villisca slept on, unaware that horror had visited in the night. The stars faded. The sky began to lighten in the east. Birds started their morning songs. And in that white house on 2nd Street, no one stirred. No one would ever stir again. Chapter 3. The Discovery. The morning of June 11th, 1912, began like any other in Villisca. Farmers rose before dawn to begin their chores. Merchants prepared to open their shops. Housewives started breakfast for their families. The sun climbed above the horizon, promising another warm summer day. 2nd Street slowly came to life as people woke and began their daily routines. But at the Moore house, no smoke rose from the kitchen chimney. The doors remained closed. The shades stayed drawn. The house gave no sign of habitation. Mary Peckham lived next door to the Moores. She was a friend of Sarah Moore, the kind of neighbour who noticed things, who paid attention to the rhythms of the households around him. As the morning advanced toward 8 o'clock, she became aware that something was amiss. The Moore family should have been up and moving by this hour. Josiah would normally have left for his business. The children would be making noise. But the house remained silent and closed, its windows covered as if everyone inside still slept. Mary Peckham felt a growing unease. It was not like the Moores to sleep so late. Sarah was an early riser, always up and attending to her household duties before most people had finished their breakfast. Mary crossed her yard and knocked on the Moores' door. No one answered. She knocked again, more firmly. Still no response. She tried the door handle. It was locked. She peered through the windows but could see nothing through the covered glass. Her concern deepened into alarm. She returned to her own house and spoke with her husband. Something was wrong at the Moore place. They could feel it. The silence was unnatural. The closed house in full morning light seemed ominous in a way neither could quite articulate. Mary's husband suggested they telephone Josiah's business partner to see if he knew anything about the family's whereabouts. Ross Moore, Josiah's brother, arrived shortly after being telephoned. He too found the house closed and unresponsive. He knocked loudly on the doors. He called out the names of his brother and sister-in-law. The silence that answered was complete and unsettling. Ross Moore tried to peer through windows, but the coverings prevented him from seeing inside. He walked around the house, checking every entrance, and found them all secured from within. Ed Selly, the town's church sexton, was contacted and asked to bring a key if one existed. When no key could be found, Ross Moore made a decision. Something was clearly wrong. He needed to get inside the house. He found a way to force entry through the back door, pushing it open after working at the lock. He stepped into the kitchen and immediately knew that catastrophe had occurred. The air inside the house was wrong. It carried a smell that Ross Moore recognized without understanding how he recognized it. The smell of death. The smell of blood. Everything was too still, too quiet. He called out again, his voice echoing through the rooms. No answer came. He moved through the downstairs, seeing the covered windows, the draped mirrors, details that registered without yet making sense. Then he climbed the stairs to the second floor. The first bedroom he entered was the one where Josiah and Sarah slept. What he saw there stopped him in the doorway. The bed was soaked with blood. The forms beneath the covers were unmistakably those of his brother and sister-in-law, but their heads had been battered beyond recognition. The walls were splattered. The floor was sticky. Ross Moore backed out of the room, his mind struggling to process what his eyes had shown him. He did not enter the other bedrooms. He did not need to. He knew what he would find. He fled down the stairs and out of the house, his face drained of colour, his hands shaking. Mary Peckham and the small group of neighbours who had gathered saw his expression and knew that their worst fears had been confirmed. Ross Moore could barely speak. He managed to say that everyone in the house was dead, that it was terrible, that they needed to call the marshal immediately. Word spread through Villisca Axe with the speed that only tragedy can generate in a small town. People emerged from their houses. Shopkeepers left their stores. Within minutes, a crowd had gathered on 2nd Street, drawn by the human instinct to converge upon disaster. They stood in the yard and in the street, speaking in hushed tones, trying to understand what could have happened inside that ordinary white house. Hank Horton, the town marshal, arrived quickly. He entered the house with several other men and made a systematic search of the rooms. What they found exceeded their worst imaginings. In every bedroom on the 2nd floor, the dead lay in their beds. 8 victims, an entire family plus their 2 young guests. All murdered in the same way, struck repeatedly in the head with what appeared to be an axe. The violence of the attack was staggering. Each victim had been struck multiple times, far more than would have been necessary to kill them. The beds were drenched in blood. The walls bore the marks of the axe blade where it had struck or swung past its target. The investigators moved through the house in a state of shock. None of them had seen anything remotely like this. Villisca was a peaceful town. Violence of any kind was rare. A murder would have been shocking enough, but this wholesale slaughter of an entire household, including 4 children, exceeded the boundaries of their experience and imagination. They documented what they saw, though their methods were those of untrained small-town lawmen, unequipped to handle a crime of this magnitude. The axe was found in the guest bedroom, leaning against the wall near where the Stillinger girls lay. It was immediately recognised as belonging to the Moore household, taken from their own yard and used against them. The handle bore no clear fingerprints, though the science of fingerprint analysis was still in its infancy and not well understood by local authorities. The blade was crusted with blood and hair. Dr. J. Clark Cooper, the local physician, was summoned to examine the bodies and estimate time of death. He moved from room to room, observing each victim. All had been killed in the same manner, struck in the head with the axe while they slept. The first blow in each case would likely have been fatal or immediately incapacitating. The subsequent blows were delivered to victims who were already dead or dying. Dr. Cooper estimated that death had occurred sometime between midnight and 5 in the morning, though he could not be more precise than that. The news reached the Stillinger family in the cruelest possible way. Joseph and Sarah Stillinger had expected their daughters to return home that morning from their overnight stay at the Moore house. When the girls did not appear, Sarah Stillinger walked to 2nd Street to fetch them. She arrived to find a crowd gathered and the house surrounded by authorities. Someone had to tell her that her daughters were inside, dead. The sound of her grief carried up and down the street, a mother's anguish at the loss of her children, adding to the horror of the day. Telegram wires carried the news beyond Villisca. By afternoon, newspapers across Iowa and neighboring states were preparing stories about the massacre. Reporters began arriving on the afternoon trains, drawn by the sensational nature of the crime. 8 people murdered in their beds. An entire family wiped out. 2 young girls killed while guests in a neighbour's home. The story had all the elements that sold papers. Innocents destroyed, children murdered, a brutal killer loose in the heartland. The bodies could not remain in the house. As the day progressed and the summer heat built, arrangements had to be made to remove the victims. Undertakers were summoned. Each body was examined in place, then carefully removed and transported to McIlvoy's undertaking establishment in town. Relatives were contacted. Plans for funerals would have to be made, though the scope of the tragedy made even this simple task complicated. How does a small town bury 8 people at once, 4 of them children, all victims of murder? The house on 2nd Street, once the scene of ordinary family life, had become a place of pilgrimage for the morbidly curious. People came from miles around to stand in the yard and stare at the windows. They wanted to be near the tragedy, to feel some connection to the horror. The authorities tried to maintain control of the scene, but their resources were limited. People trampled through the yard. Souvenir hunters attempted to take objects from the house. The crime scene, already compromised by untrained investigators, became further contaminated by the general public's intrusion. Inside the house, evidence was collected in haphazard fashion. The bloody water in the bowl, the cigarette butts, the coverings from the windows and mirrors, the bedding and clothing. Everything was noted, but the science of crime scene investigation was rudimentary at best. No one thought to secure the house and preserve it exactly as the killer had left it. No one understood the importance of maintaining a clear chain of custody for evidence. The local authorities did their best, but they were overwhelmed by the magnitude of the crime and the attention it generated. As darkness fell on the 11th of June, Villisca existed in a state of terror unlike anything it had ever known. A killer had walked the streets of their town, had entered a home and murdered 8 people, including 4 children, and had vanished without leaving any clear indication of identity or motive. Every house was locked tight that night. Guns were loaded and kept near at hand. Neighbours eyed one another with suspicion. Trust, the foundation of small-town life, had been shattered, along with the lives lost in the Moore house. The darkness held new meaning now. It concealed not just the peaceful rest of a farming community, but the possibility of unspeakable violence waiting in the shadows. Chapter 4. The Scene of Slaughter. The investigation into the murders began in earnest on the 12th of June, though much had already been lost to the chaos of the previous day. The house on 2nd Street remained at the centre of attention, a structure transformed from home to horror show by the events that had unfolded within its walls. Authorities attempted to reconstruct what had happened during those dark hours between midnight and dawn, piecing together the sequence of violence from the evidence left behind. The marshal and his deputies, along with county officials who had been summoned from nearby towns, moved through the house with greater care now, trying to understand the mind of the killer through the actions he had taken. Every detail was scrutinized. Every mark on the walls was examined. Every piece of displaced furniture was noted. What emerged was a picture of methodical brutality, of someone who had moved through the house with terrible purpose, killing each occupant systematically before engaging in bizarre post-murder behavior that suggested a disturbed and complicated psychology. The sequence of death appeared to begin in the master bedroom where Josiah and Sarah Moore had slept. The killer had entered their room first, standing in the doorway with the axe in hand, watching them sleep before beginning the attack. Josiah received the first blows. The force of the strikes drove the head of the axe through his skull and into his brain. Blood had sprayed across the headboard and wall in arterial patterns that spoke to the violence of the initial impact. He would have died almost instantly, his body perhaps jerking reflexively as the brainstem was destroyed. Sarah Moore had been struck next. Whether she woke at the sound of her husband being killed or remained asleep until the axe found her was impossible to determine. She received at least as many blows as her husband, perhaps more. The killer had struck her repeatedly, the axe rising and falling in a rhythm of destruction that continued well past the point of death. Her skull was crushed. The pillows beneath her head were soaked through with blood. The investigators who examined her body counted at least 7 distinct wounds on her head, any one of which would have been fatal. The ferocity of the attack on the parents suggested rage or fear, or perhaps the killer's need to ensure that the adults in the house were eliminated first and completely. Josiah Moore was a grown man, capable of fighting back if given the chance. Sarah might have screamed, alerting the children or neighbours. The killer took no chances. The assault was overwhelming and immediate, giving neither victim any opportunity to resist or cry out. From the master bedroom, the killer had moved to the southwest bedroom where Herman and Boyd Moore slept together. The boys shared a bed, their bodies close together under the covers. The killer stood over them as he had stood over their parents, the axe ready. Herman, being older and larger, was likely struck first. The same devastating force, the same multiple blows. The 11-year-old boy's skull shattered under the impact. Blood splashed across the headboard and onto the wall behind the bed. Boyd Moore, 7 years old, lay beside his brother. He may have been woken by the sound of Herman being killed, or the motion of the bed, or the warm spray of his brother's blood. If he woke, he had no time to react. The axe found him immediately. His small body received blow after blow, the killer ensuring that this child, like all the others, would never wake to tell what had happened in the house that night. The bedding in the boys' room was drenched. The floor beneath the bed bore stains where blood had soaked through the mattress and dripped down. Little Paul Moore, not quite 5 years old, slept alone in the smallest bedroom. He was perhaps the most defenseless of all the victims, a tiny child who could have posed no conceivable threat to anyone. Yet the killer entered his room and murdered him with the same brutal efficiency employed in the other bedrooms. Paul received multiple blows to his small head. The investigators who examined his body later would struggle to maintain their professional composure. The murder of children is difficult for any civilized person to comprehend. The murder of a child this young, killed in his bed while sleeping, exceeded the boundaries of their emotional capacity to process. Finally, the killer had entered the northwest bedroom where Catherine Moore and the Stillinger sisters lay sleeping together. 3 girls, aged 12, 10 and 8. They had been so happy to spend the night together, so excited by what had seemed like an adventure. Now they lay dead, their blood mingled on the pillows and bedding they had shared. Each girl received multiple blows to the head. The killer showed no mercy, no hesitation. The axe fell upon them as it had fallen upon the others, crushing bone, destroying brain tissue, ending life after life after life. What happened after the killing was perhaps as disturbing as the murders themselves. The killer did not flee immediately. Instead, he engaged in a series of actions that revealed a mind operating according to some internal logic that defied normal understanding. He moved through the house, covering mirrors and windows. Every reflective surface in the downstairs rooms was draped with fabric or clothing. Every window that might allow someone to see inside it was covered. The house was transformed into a tomb, sealed off from the outside world, dark and enclosed. In the bedrooms, the killer pulled bedclothes up over the faces of the dead. This action was performed for each victim, as if the killer could not bear to see what he had done, or perhaps as if he were tucking them in for a final sleep. In the guest bedroom where the Stillinger girls lay, their nightgowns had become disarranged during the attack. The killer took time to cover their bodies, pulling fabric over them with what might have been interpreted as an attempt at modesty or perhaps shame at what he had done. The bowl of bloody water in the kitchen suggested the killer had attempted to wash after the murders. Blood would have covered his hands and arms, perhaps his face and clothing. He had taken time to fill a basin and clean himself, an act that required remaining in the house for some period after the killings. The water in the bowl had been examined and found to contain diluted blood, confirming that someone had used it to wash. The cigarette butts found in various rooms indicated the killer had smoked while in the house. Perhaps he had needed to calm himself after the violence. Perhaps he simply sat in the darkness among the dead, thinking whatever thoughts occur to someone who has just murdered 8 people. The cigarettes were of a common brand, offering no particular clue to the killer's identity. Many men smoked. The butts could have belonged to anyone. The axe itself was examined closely. It belonged to the Moore household, kept in their yard by the chopping block. The killer had not brought his own weapon, but had used what was available at the scene. This suggested either opportunism or familiarity with the property. Someone who knew the Moore household well enough to know where they kept their axe. The handle bore smudges that might have been fingerprints, but the science of identification through fingerprints was still developing, and the local authorities lacked the expertise to properly collect and analyse such evidence. No signs of forced entry could be found. The doors had been locked when neighbours arrived in the morning, yet the killer had gained access during the night. This suggested either that someone had a key, or that a door or window had been left unlocked by the Moore family before they retired. It was common in small towns for people to be less vigilant about locks than the city of dwellers. Many families in Villisca rarely lock their doors at all. The Moores had locked their front door, but perhaps the back door or window had been left accessible. The motive for the murders remained completely obscure. Nothing had been stolen from the house. Josiah Moore's wallet containing money was found untouched. Sarah's jewellery remained in her bedroom. The house had not been ransacked. Robbery could be ruled out as a motive. This was not a burglary gone wrong. This was purposeful murder, planned and executed with terrible efficiency. Sexual assault was considered as a possible motive, particularly given the attention paid to covering the Stillinger girls' bodies. Dr. Cooper performed examinations of the female victims but found no evidence of rape or sexual interference. Whatever the killer's motivations had been, they did not appear to be sexual in nature, at least not in any straightforward sense. The covering of the bodies might have indicated shame or some psychological need related to the killer's own issues, but it did not appear to be connected to sexual violence. The question of why haunted everyone who studied the crime. Why the Moore family? Why these particular victims? Josiah Moore was a respected businessman with no known enemies beyond ordinary business rivalries. Sarah was known as a kind woman, active in her church, devoted to her family. The children were innocent by any measure. The Stillinger girls had simply been in the wrong place at the wrong time, victims of terrible chance that had led them to accept Catherine Moore's invitation to stay the night. Some theorised that Josiah Moore had been the primary target and the others had been killed to eliminate witnesses. But this theory failed to account for the excessive violence visited upon each victim. If the goal was simply to silence witnesses, 1 or 2 blows per person would have sufficed. Instead, each victim had been struck multiple times, their heads battered far beyond what was necessary to ensure death. This spoke to rage or frenzy, or some psychological need on the killer's part that went beyond practical considerations. Others suggested that the killer was insane, that the crime was the work of a lunatic operating without rational motive. This theory had the virtue of explaining the inexplicable, but it satisfied no one. Even madness follows certain patterns. Even the insane have reasons for their actions, however twisted those reasons might be. Simply dismissing the murders as the work of a madman closed off avenues of investigation that might lead to the killer's identity. As word of the details spread, fear intensified throughout Villisca and the surrounding countryside. People understood now that this had not been a simple murder, not a crime of passion or a robbery gone wrong. This had been something far worse, a massacre, a slaughter of innocents, the work of someone capable of killing children in their beds without hesitation or mercy. Such a person might strike again. Every family with children felt vulnerable. Every house seemed less secure. The darkness that fell each evening brought with it a renewed sense of dread. The funerals were held on June 13th, just 2 days after the bodies were discovered. The logistics of burying 8 people simultaneously overwhelmed the small town. The Moore family was laid to rest together in a service attended by hundreds. The Stillinger girls were buried separately, their funeral equally well attended. The entire town turned out to mourn. People stood in the streets outside the churches, unable to fit inside. They wept openly, strangers and friends alike, united in grief and horror at what had happened in their midst. The graveside services were brief. The weather was hot. The crowds were enormous. Ministers spoke of faith and eternal rest and the mystery of God's will. But their words rang hollow against the magnitude of the tragedy. What comfort could be offered to a community that had lost 8 of its members to such senseless violence? What explanation could be given for the murder of children? The mourners left the cemeteries with their questions unanswered, their grief unabated, their fear undiminished. The house on 2nd Street stood empty now. No one wanted to enter it. No one wanted to live where such horrors had occurred. It had become a cursed place, marked forever by the blood that had soaked into its floors and walls. People walked past it quickly, averting their eyes, as if looking too long at the structure might invite some of the evil that had visited there to follow them home. The white paint seemed less pure now, the windows like dead eyes. The house had become a monument to murder, a physical reminder that safety was an illusion and that death could come in the night without warning. Chapter 5, A Town in Terror. Villisca transformed in the days following the murders. The small farming community that had prided itself on neighbourliness and trust became a place of suspicion and fear. People who had known each other for years suddenly saw potential killers in familiar faces. Strangers were watched with open hostility. Locks that had rarely been used were engaged every night. Guns were purchased by families who had never before felt the need for weapons in their homes. The social fabric of the town, woven from decades of shared experience and mutual reliance, began to unravel. The investigation expanded rapidly, drawing in authorities from across Iowa and beyond. The Burns Detective Agency from Kansas City sent agents to assist the local lawmen. The agency was known for its work on difficult cases, and the magnitude of the Villisca murders demanded expertise that the small-town marshal and his deputies simply did not possess. The private detectives arrived with their notebooks and their theories, interviewing townspeople, examining evidence, attempting to construct a narrative that would lead them to the killer. Everyone in Villisca became a potential suspect or witness. The investigators cast their net wide, questioning people about their whereabouts on the night of the 10th and morning of the 11th. Where had they been? Who had they seen? Had they noticed anything unusual? The questions were asked again and again of men and women, young and old, respected citizens and marginal figures alike. No one was above suspicion. Murder of this magnitude demanded that every possibility be explored. The railroad station became a focus of investigation. Villisca was connected to the wider world by rail, and that connection ran both ways. Trains brought people into town and carried them away again. Several people had been observed at the station around the time of the murders. Strangers had been noted arriving on the evening train and departing on the morning train after the bodies were discovered. Each of these individuals had to be tracked down and questioned. Most proved to have innocent reasons for their travel. But the process was slow and painstaking, and each dead end added to the investigators' frustration. Travelling salesmen, of which there were several in town around the time of the murders, came under particular scrutiny. These drummers, as they were called, moved from town to town selling their wares, staying in hotels or boarding houses, maintaining no permanent ties to the communities they visited. They were by definition transient and unknown. Any of them might have committed the murders and then simply boarded a train the next morning, disappearing into the vast network of rail lines that crisscrossed the country. Several salesmen were identified, located and questioned. Their alibis were checked. None emerged as a serious suspect, but the process consumed weeks of investigative effort. The question of motive continued to plague the investigation. Without understanding why the murders had been committed, it was difficult to know where to look for the killer. If Josiah Moore had been the primary target, then investigators needed to examine his business dealings and personal relationships for someone who might have wished him harm. If the crime was random, the work of a madman selecting victims by chance, then the field of suspects became impossibly wide. If there was some other motive, something personal or psychological that connected the killer to the Moore household, then that connection needed to be identified before the killer could be found. Josiah Moore's business relationships came under intense examination. He had been partners in the implement company with a man named Frank Jones before leaving to start his own business with a different partner. Jones was a wealthy and powerful man, a state senator with significant influence in Iowa politics. He was known to have resented Moore's departure from his employ. The two men had been rivals in business ever since. Could this rivalry have escalated into murder? It seemed far-fetched, but in the absence of any better theory, even unlikely possibilities had to be explored. Frank Jones had been at the Children's Day program on the evening of June 10th. He had seen the Moore family there. He had known they would be returning home that night. When questioned by investigators, he provided an alibi for the hours when the murders were believed to have occurred. He had been at home, he said, in bed with his wife. His wife confirmed this, but wives had been known to lie for their husbands, and the investigators remained suspicious. Jones had motive, means, and opportunity. The fact that he was a respected member of the community and a state senator did not place him above suspicion in a case as serious as this. William Mansfield, who worked for Frank Jones, also drew attention. He was known to be a troubled man, given to drinking and violent outbursts. Some whispered that Jones might have hired Mansfield to commit the murders, eliminating a business rival while keeping his own hands clean. Mansfield's whereabouts on the night of the murders were unclear. He had been in the general area, but he could not provide a solid alibi for the crucial hours. He became a person of interest, watched and questioned repeatedly by investigators who sensed that he knew more than he was telling. The Reverend George Kelly emerged as another suspect, though by a different route. Kelly was a travelling minister who had been in Villisca at the time of the murders. He had attended the Children's Day program at the Presbyterian Church, sitting in the congregation and watching the children perform. He had left town on the morning train after the bodies were discovered, departing Villisca just as news of the murders was beginning to spread. His timing was suspicious. His behaviour before and after the murders raised questions. Kelly was an odd man, even by the standards of itinerant preachers. He was nervous and erratic, given to strange pronouncements and inappropriate remarks. He had a history of mental instability. In the weeks after the murders, he began making statements that drew attention to himself. He spoke of the crime in detail, claiming knowledge of aspects of the murders that had not been made public. He seemed fascinated by the case, bringing it up in conversations and speculating about the killer's identity and motives in ways that struck people as unhealthy and suspicious. When questioned, Kelly's behaviour grew even more erratic. He denied involvement but seemed unable to stop talking about the murders. He contradicted himself repeatedly. His alibis for the crucial hours fell apart under scrutiny. He could not provide a coherent account of his movements on the night of June 10th and the morning of June 11th. The more he talked, the guiltier he appeared. Investigators began to focus their attention on him, believing they might have found their man. But suspicion is not proof, and Kelly's strange behaviour did not constitute evidence sufficient for arrest. The investigators needed more. They needed witnesses who could place him at the Moore house that night. They needed physical evidence linking him to the crime scene. They needed a confession. Kelly provided none of these things. He remained a suspect, watched and followed, but free to move about while the investigation continued to search for the final pieces that would connect him definitively to the murders. Meanwhile, Villisca struggled to return to some semblance of normal life. Businesses reopened, farmers returned to their fields, children resumed their play, though with less freedom and more supervision than before. Parents kept their children close, fearful of letting them out of sight. The carefree quality that had characterized a childhood in the small town before the murders was gone, replaced by wariness and constraint. The children sensed the change in their parents, the underlying fear that now colored every interaction. Social gatherings became tense affairs. People who met at church or in shops exchanged gossip about the investigation, speculating endlessly about who might have committed the murders. Theories multiplied and spread. Every odd behaviour from the past was re-examined in light of the crime. Old grudges were remembered and reinterpreted as possible motives. Innocent eccentricities became evidence of dangerous instability. The town turned upon itself, suspicion breeding suspicion in an ever-widening spiral. Some families left Villisca entirely, unable to bear living in a place where such horror had occurred. They loaded their possessions onto wagons or into railroad cars and departed for other towns, other states, anywhere that might feel safer than this cursed place. Those who remained did so, either because they lacked the means to leave or because they refused to be driven from their homes by fear. But even those who stayed acknowledged that Villisca had changed forever. Innocence, once lost, could not be recovered. The press continued to give the story prominent coverage. Newspapers across the country ran articles about the Villisca murders, often accompanied by lurid illustrations and sensational headlines. The coverage brought curious visitors to the town, people who wanted to see the house where the murders had occurred, to walk the streets where a killer had moved unseen and unknown. These gawkers were resented by the townspeople, who saw them as vultures feeding on tragedy. But there was no way to keep them out. The railroad brought them in by the dozens, tourists of disaster, and they wandered through Villisca with their cameras and their notebooks, treating the town's nightmare as entertainment. The house on 2nd Street became a particular attraction. People stood in the yard taking photographs. Some tried to enter the building, forcing the authorities to post guards to keep out trespassers. Souvenir hunters attempted to take objects from the property, pieces of wood or fragments of brick, anything that might serve as a tangible connection to the famous murders. The Moore family had been buried, but their home remained, a physical site where the curious could come to feel close to horror and death. As summer advanced toward autumn, the investigation continued without resolution. Suspects were identified, questioned, and sometimes held for a time before being released when evidence failed to materialize. Tips poured in from across the country, people reporting suspicious behavior or claiming to have information about the crime. Each tip had to be investigated, resources deployed to check stories that almost invariably proved to be false or irrelevant. The investigators grew weary and frustrated, knowing that somewhere out there was a man who had murdered 8 people and successfully evaded justice. The killer, whoever he was, had demonstrated remarkable self-control. He had not boasted of his crime or confessed to anyone. He had not struck again, at least not in any way that could be definitively linked to the Villisca murders. He had simply vanished into the fabric of American life, indistinguishable from millions of other men going about their daily business. This restraint suggested either innocence of anyone seriously suspected, or a calculated intelligence that made the killer all the more dangerous. A man capable of planning and executing such a crime, then remaining silent and hidden afterward, was a formidable adversary. Villisca entered the winter of 1912 with the case still unsolved. Snow covered the streets and fields, transforming the landscape into something clean and white. But the snow could not cover the stain that had been left on the town's collective soul. Beneath the white blanket, the earth remembered blood. In the White House on 2nd Street, now empty and beginning to show signs of neglect, the floors still bore the marks of what had happened there. And in the minds of those who had lived through that terrible June, the memories remained vivid and terrible, refusing to fade with time or distance. Chapter 6. The suspects emerge. As 1913 began, the investigation into the Villisca murders had produced no arrests and no resolution. The initial flood of tips and leads had slowed to a trickle. The newspapers, having exhausted the immediate story, moved on to other options, but the authorities continued their work, methodically examining every person who might have had reason to enter the Moore house that night, every individual whose behavior before or after the murders suggested guilt or knowledge of the crime. Frank Jones remained under scrutiny despite his position and influence. The state senator had built a successful business empire in southwestern Iowa, dealing in farm implements and machinery. His rivalry with Josiah Moore was well documented. Moore had worked for Jones before leaving to establish his own competing business. The departure had been acrimonious. Jones was known to speak bitterly of Moore, referring to him as a traitor and a thief who had stolen customers and business secrets. The question was whether this business animosity could have escalated into murder. The investigators looked closely at Jones's movements on the night of June 10th. He had attended the Children's Day program at the Presbyterian Church, sitting among the congregation, visible to dozens of witnesses. After the program ended, he claimed to have gone directly home with his wife. The walk from the church to his residence would have taken approximately 15 minutes. Once home, he said, he had remained there for the rest of the night. His wife corroborated this account in every detail, but investigators noted certain inconsistencies and curiosities in Jones's story. He had been seen speaking with several men after the church program ended, conversations that had lasted long enough that some witnesses remembered them. What had been discussed? Jones claimed the conversations were trivial, mere pleasantries exchanged with acquaintances, but others suggested the discussions had been more intense, involving business matters or personal grievances. The exact content remained unclear, filtered through memory, and shaped by subsequent knowledge of the murders. More troubling was Jones's relationship with William Mansfield, a man who worked for him in various capacities. Mansfield was younger than Jones, perhaps 40 years old at the time of the murders. He was known around Villisca as a heavy drinker and a violent man when intoxicated. He had been arrested several times for assault and public drunkenness. He worked intermittently for Jones, performing odd jobs and occasionally travelling on business matters related to Jones's various enterprises. The exact nature of their relationship was unclear, but it appeared to go beyond simple employer and employee. Mansfield's whereabouts on the night of the murders could not be definitively established. He claimed to have been in a town some miles from Villisca, staying at a hotel, but the hotel records were incomplete, and no witness could definitively place him there during the crucial hours between midnight and dawn. He had access to a horse and buggy through his employment with Jones. He could have travelled to Villisca, committed the murders, and returned to his claim location before morning. The timeline was tight but possible. Rumours began to circulate, whispered in saloons and discussed in private conversations, that Jones had hired Mansfield to kill Josiah Moore and his family. The theory had a certain logic to it. Jones had motive in the form of his business rivalry with Moore. Mansfield had the temperament for violence and the need for money that might make him willing to commit murder for hire. If true, it meant the crime was not the work of a lone madman, but a calculated assassination carried out by one man at the behest of another. The implications were staggering. It suggested that a state senator had ordered the murder of 8 people, including 4 children, to eliminate a business rival. The investigators pressed both men repeatedly. Jones maintained his innocence with the confidence of someone accustomed to authority and respect. He pointed to his alibi, to his position in the community, to the absurdity of the accusation. Would a state senator, a man of wealth and influence, resort to such crude violence over a business dispute? The suggestion was preposterous, an insult to his character and reputation. He threatened legal action against anyone who publicly accused him of involvement in the murders. Mansfield was less composed under questioning. He grew angry and defensive, his denials becoming louder and more vehement the more he was pressed. He admitted knowing Josiah Moore by sight and reputation, but claimed no personal animosity toward him. He insisted he had been nowhere near Villisca on the night of the murders. When confronted with the weakness of his alibi, he became belligerent, accusing the investigators of harassing him because he was a working man without the resources to defend himself properly. His behaviour aroused suspicion, but suspicion alone was insufficient to support charges. The Reverend George Kelly continued to draw attention through his own actions. In the months following the murders, he had travelled through Iowa and neighbouring states, preaching at various churches and camp meetings. But wherever he went, he seemed unable to stop talking about the Villisca murders. He brought them up in sermons, using the crime as an example of human depravity and divine judgment. He discussed the details with anyone who would listen, speculating about the killer's identity and methods in ways that struck many as inappropriate and disturbing. Kelly's behaviour grew increasingly erratic. He wrote letters to newspapers offering his theories about the crime. He contacted investigators volunteering information and suggestions. He seemed desperate to be involved in the case, to be recognised as someone with special knowledge or insight. This need for attention raised questions. Why was he so fascinated with the murders? Why did he keep inserting himself into the investigation? The most innocent explanation was that Kelly was simply a man of unusual character, socially awkward and perhaps mentally unstable, who had become fixated on a sensational crime that had occurred while he happened to be passing through Villisca. But there was another possibility. Kelly's knowledge of certain details that had not been widely publicised suggested he might have been present at the scene. He knew about the covered mirrors and windows. He knew about the positioning of the bodies. He knew details about the wounds inflicted on the victims. When asked how he had acquired this knowledge, his explanations were vague and contradictory. Perhaps he had learned these details from newspaper accounts or from conversations with people who had been inside the house after the bodies were discovered. Or perhaps he knew them because he had been there that night, had been the one who covered the mirrors and arranged the bodies and wielded the axe. In the spring of 1914, nearly 2 years after the murders, Kelly was arrested in connection with the crime. The arrest came after months of continued investigation and mounting evidence of his involvement, though much of that evidence was circumstantial. He had been in Villisca at the time of the murders. He had left town shortly after the bodies were discovered. His knowledge of details suggested presence at the scene. His behaviour after the murders suggested a guilty conscience or disturbed mind. The authorities believed they had sufficient cause to bring him to trial. Kelly's arrest brought renewed attention to the case. Newspapers that had moved on to other stories returned to Villisca, sending reporters to cover the developments. The town, which had begun to achieve some measure of normalcy in the 2 years since the murders, found itself once again thrust into the national spotlight. The White House on 2nd Street, which had stood mostly empty and neglected, became a pilgrimage site once more as people came to see the place where the crime had occurred that might finally be solved. But the case against Kelly was not as strong as prosecutors would have liked. Much of the evidence was behavioural rather than physical. He had acted strangely. He had said suspicious things. He had been present in Villisca at the relevant time. But there was no witness who had seen him at the Morehouse that night. There was no physical evidence connecting him to the crime scene. His fingerprints, to the extent that usable prints could be obtained with the technology of the time, did not match any found in the house. The bloody axe bore no trace of him. The prosecution's case rested largely on Kelly's own statements. He had made various remarks over the 2 years since the murders that could be interpreted as admissions of guilt or specialised knowledge that only the killer would possess. But these statements were often vague or ambiguous, open to multiple interpretations. Kelly himself denied any involvement in the murders, claiming that his interest in the case was merely that of a minister concerned with the human sin and divine justice. His strange behaviour, he maintained, was simply his nature, the result of nervous temperament and religious zeal rather than guilty conscience. Other suspects continued to be investigated even as Kelly sat in jail awaiting trial. The Burns Detective Agency, still working on the case, pursued leads that pointed in different directions. A man named Henry Moore, no relation to the victims, had been seen in Villisca around the time of the murders. He was a transient, moving from town to town without permanent employment or residence. When questioned, he could not provide a clear account of his whereabouts on the night of June 10th. He became a person of interest, was investigated thoroughly before being cleared when evidence suggested he had been in a different town entirely when the murders occurred. Andy Sawyer, a local man with a reputation for violence and drinking, also drew scrutiny. He had been heard making threatening remarks about Josiah Moore in the weeks before the murders, though the exact nature of his grievance remained unclear. Some suggested it related to a business transaction that had gone badly. Others thought it might have been personal, perhaps involving a woman both men had known. Sawyer was questioned extensively but maintained his innocence. His alibi for the night of the murders was weak but could not be definitively disproven. He remained a suspect in the minds of some investigators, though charges were never brought against him. The multiplicity of suspects created its own problems for the investigation. Resources were divided among several competing theories. Evidence that might have pointed clearly to one individual became muddled when considered in the context of other possible perpetrators. The investigators found themselves chasing shadows, pursuing leads that branched and diverged until the original trail grew cold. Each suspect seemed plausible when considered in isolation, but none emerged as the clear and obvious killer that the evidence demanded. The question of whether the Villisca murders were connected to other similar crimes also remained unresolved. In the years before and after the Moore family's deaths, several other axe murders had occurred in towns across the Midwest. Families killed in their beds while sleeping. The same pattern of violence, the same use of an axe as the murder weapon, the same lack of clear motive. Were these crimes the work of a single individual, a killer who moved through the heartland selecting victims according to some internal logic known only to him? Or were they unrelated incidents, separate tragedies that happened to share certain characteristics? In Paola, Kansas, in 1911, a family had been murdered with an axe while they slept. In Monmouth, Illinois, in 1911, a similar crime had occurred. In Ellsworth, Kansas, in October of 1911, 3 people were killed with an axe in their home. In Colorado Springs, Colorado, in September of 1911, an entire family was murdered with an axe. The pattern was unmistakable. Families attacked at night while sleeping. The weapon always an axe. The violence always extreme, with victims receiving far more blows than necessary to kill them. No clear motive, no witnesses, no arrests. If these crimes were connected, if they were indeed the work of one person, then that individual was responsible for the deaths of dozens of people across multiple states over a period of several years. He would be one of the most prolific serial killers in American history, moving through the countryside with impunity, selecting targets and escaping detection time after time. The thought was almost too terrible to contemplate. A man who killed entire families, who murdered children in their beds, who walked away from scenes of carnage and blended back into normal society, indistinguishable from any other travelling salesman or itinerant worker. The investigators attempted to connect the crimes, looking for patterns in the timing, the locations, the characteristics of the victims, but the distances involved were vast. Communication between law enforcement agencies in different states was limited and slow. Records were incomplete. Some of the crimes had been inadequately investigated at the time they occurred. Local authorities lacking the expertise or resources to properly document the scenes and collect evidence. By the time anyone thought to connect them to the Villisca murders, crucial details had been lost or forgotten. As summer approached in 1914, exactly 2 years after the murders, Villisca prepared for Kelly's trial. The courthouse in Red Oak, the county seat, would be the venue. The prosecution had assembled its case, such as it was, built on circumstantial evidence and Kelly's own suspicious behaviour. The defence prepared to argue that Kelly was merely an odd man, mentally unstable perhaps, but not a murderer. The trial would be a spectacle, drawing crowds and press attention. The people of Villisca hoped that it would finally bring closure, that Kelly would be convicted, and the nightmare that had begun on June 11th, 1912, would at last come to an end. But justice in a case this complex was never guaranteed, and the path to truth was proving far more difficult than anyone had imagined. Chapter 7. The Reverend Under Scrutiny. The trial of George Kelly began in September of 1917, more than 5 years after the murders. The delay had been caused by various legal complications, changes in jurisdiction, and Kelly's own mental state, which had deteriorated significantly in the years since his arrest. He had been confined to various institutions and jails, his behaviour becoming increasingly erratic. By the time he finally stood trial, he was a diminished figure, gaunt and trembling, his eyes holding the distant look of someone whose grip on reality had loosened considerably. The courtroom in Red Oak was filled to capacity on the first day of the trial. People had come from across Iowa and from neighbouring states to witness what they hoped would be the resolution of the most notorious unsolved crime in the region's history. The jury had been selected with great care. 12 men chosen from the surrounding counties, men who had not been directly affected by the murders, but who understood the gravity of the case. They took their seats with solemn expressions, aware that they held the power to condemn a man to death or set him free. The prosecution opened with a recitation of the basic facts of the crime. On the night of June 10, 1912, 8 people had been murdered in their beds in Villisca, Iowa. The victims were Josiah Moore, age 43, Sarah Moore, age 42, Herman Moore, age 11, Catherine Moore, age 10, Boyd Moore, age 7, Paul Moore, age 5, Lena Stillinger, age 12, and Ina Stillinger, age 8. Each had been struck multiple times in the head with an axe. The violence had been extreme. The crime had shocked the nation and remained unsolved for 5 years until the arrest of the defendant, the Reverend George Jacqueline Kelly. The prosecutor laid out the case against Kelly methodically. He had been in Villisca on the day and night of the murders. He had attended the Children's Day program at the Presbyterian Church, sitting in the congregation and watching the Moore children perform. He had been seen in the vicinity of the Moore house on 2nd Street. He had left town on the morning train after the bodies were discovered, departing just as news of the murders began to spread through the community. His timing was suspicious. His behaviour in the years following the murders had been bizarre and incriminating. The prosecution called witnesses who testified to Kelly's statements about the crime. He had discussed the murders obsessively, bringing them up in conversations and sermons with a frequency that struck people as unhealthy. He had demonstrated knowledge of details that had not been widely publicised, details that suggested he had been inside the Moore house after the killings occurred. He knew about the covered mirrors and windows. He knew about the positioning of the bodies. He knew about the axe being left in the guest bedroom where the Stillinger girls had died. One witness, a fellow minister who had travelled with Kelly for a time after the murders, testified that Kelly had made statements that could be interpreted as confessions. During one conversation, Kelly had supposedly said that God had called upon him to sacrifice the Moore family, that they had been sinners who required divine punishment. In another instance, he had allegedly said that he had been present in Villisca on the night of the murders and had witnessed terrible things. The witness claimed Kelly had wept while making these statements, overcome by emotion that might have been remorse or religious ecstasy or mental disturbance. The prosecution introduced evidence of Kelly's mental instability. He had a history of erratic behaviour. He had been institutionalized briefly before the murders for what was described as nervous exhaustion. He heard voices, he claimed, divine communications that directed his actions. He had been known to go days without sleeping, driven by what he described as religious fervour, but what others interpreted as mania. He was, the prosecution argued, exactly the kind of disturbed individual who might commit such a heinous crime and then be unable to keep silent about it afterward. But the defense challenged every aspect of the prosecution's case. Kelly's attorney, a capable lawyer from Des Moines, began by attacking the reliability of the witness testimony. The statements Kelly had supposedly made about the murders were vague and ambiguous, open to multiple interpretations. A man might know details about a famous crime without having committed it. Information spreads through communities. Newspapers publish accounts. People gossip. Kelly's knowledge of certain details did not prove he had been present at the crime scene. The defense argued that Kelly's obsessive interest in the murders was the result of his religious nature and his mental instability, not his guilt. He was a man who saw sin and judgment everywhere. The Villisca murders had occurred while he happened to be passing through the town. The timing was coincidental, not causal. His subsequent fascination with the crime was that of a disturbed minister who believed he saw divine significance in the tragedy, not the guilty conscience of a murderer unable to remain silent about his deeds. The defense called witnesses who testified to Kelly's whereabouts on the night of the murders. A woman who ran a boarding house in Villisca claimed Kelly had been in his room at her establishment during the crucial hours. She had heard him moving about, she said, pacing and praying as he often did at night. He could not have left the boarding house, committed the murders, and returned without her knowledge. Her testimony directly contradicted the prosecution's theory that Kelly had gone to the Moore house during the night. Other witnesses testified to Kelly's character. He was odd, they agreed, and mentally unstable. But he was not violent. No one had ever known him to harm another person. He ranted about sin and judgment, but many ministers did the same. His religious fervour was extreme but not unprecedented. The defence stated that the prosecution was asking the jury to convict a man of murdering 8 people based on suspicious behaviour and ambiguous statements, without any physical evidence connecting him to the crime. The axe that had been used in the murders was introduced as evidence. It had been kept by the authorities for 5 years, carefully preserved, but it bore no fingerprints that could be definitively identified as Kelly's. The technology for fingerprint analysis had improved considerably since 1912. But even with modern techniques, the axe yielded no clear proof of Kelly's involvement. Blood tests, still a relatively new forensic tool, could confirm that the stains on the axe were human blood, but they could not identify whose blood it was or who had wielded the weapon. The condition of the Moore house on the morning the bodies were discovered was discussed in detail. The covered mirrors and windows, the draped bedding, the bowl of bloody water, the cigarette butts. The defence argued that these details pointed to a careful, methodical killer, someone who had remained at the scene for a considerable time after the murders. Kelly, they suggested, was too unstable and erratic to have committed such a controlled and deliberate crime. The murders required planning, patience, and nerve. Kelly demonstrated none of these qualities in his daily life. The prosecution countered that mental instability could take many forms. A man who heard voices and believed himself to be carrying out divine commands might be capable of acts that would be impossible for him in his normal state. Religious mania had driven people to commit terrible acts throughout history. Kelly's belief that he was an instrument of God's will could have given him the strength and determination to carry out the murders, even if his normal personality was weak and indecisive. The trial lasted for weeks. Witness after witness took the stand. Evidence was presented and challenged. Legal arguments consumed hours. The jury listened intently, taking notes, their faces revealing nothing of their thoughts. The people of Villisca, who had managed to secure seats in the courtroom, attended every session, hungry for any detail that might explain what had happened in their town 5 years earlier. The defence produced evidence of other possible suspects. William Mansfield's name was mentioned, along with the theory that he had committed the murders at the behest of Frank Jones. The defence argued that the investigation had been flawed from the beginning, focusing too narrowly on Kelly while ignoring other individuals who had stronger motives and clearer connections to the victims. The prosecution objected that the defence was attempting to try other men who were not present in the courtroom and could not defend themselves against these accusations. Expert witnesses testified about the wounds inflicted on the victims. A physician who had examined the bodies described the massive trauma to each skull, the multiple blows delivered with terrible force. He estimated that the killer would have been covered in blood after the attacks, splattered from head to foot with the physical evidence of his violence. Yet no one had seen Kelly with blood on his clothing. No bloody garments had been found in his possession. If he had committed the murders, what had he done with the clothes he wore that night? The prosecution suggested Kelly had washed at the bowl found in the Moore kitchen, then disposed of his bloody clothing somewhere between the house and the railroad station. But the defence pointed out that this theory required Kelly to have carried spare clothing with him, to have changed completely, and to have disposed of the evidence so thoroughly that no trace of it could be found 5 years later. Was this consistent with the behaviour of a mentally unstable man who could not stop talking about the crime? If Kelly was so disturbed that he compulsively confessed, would he also have been capable of such careful concealment of physical evidence? The closing arguments were passionate on both sides. The prosecution painted Kelly as a religious madman who had murdered 8 innocent people in a delusional belief that he was carrying out God's will. They pointed to his presence in Villisca, his suspicious departure, his obsessive interest in the crime, his incriminating statements. They asked the jury to look at the totality of the evidence and conclude that only one person could have committed these murders, and that person was sitting in the courtroom before them. The defense portrayed Kelly as a scapegoat, a convenient target for a frustrated investigation that had failed to find the real killer. They emphasized the lack of physical evidence, the weakness of the witness testimony, the existence of other suspects who had not been properly investigated. They argued that convicting Kelly would be a miscarriage of justice, sending an innocent, if disturbed, man to his death, while the true murderer remained free. They asked the jury to require proof beyond a reasonable doubt and to find that such proof had not been provided. The jury deliberated for 2 days. When they returned to the courtroom, their faces were drawn and tired. The foreman stood and delivered the verdict. Not guilty, George Kelly was acquitted of the murders of the Moore family and the Stillinger sisters. The courtroom erupted in noise, some people shouting in anger, others in relief. Kelly himself showed little reaction, his face blank, his eyes distant. He was led from the courtroom a free man, though his freedom would prove to be limited by his deteriorating mental state. The people of Villisca received the news with mixed emotions. Some believed justice had been served, that an innocent man had been spared from execution for a crime he did not commit. Others were furious, convinced that Kelly was guilty and had escaped punishment through legal technicalities and incompetent prosecution. The divisions that had opened in the community 5 years earlier widened further. Trust, already damaged, eroded further still. George Kelly did not return to his former life after the trial. His mental condition had worsened during his years of confinement and legal proceedings. He was eventually institutionalized, spending his remaining years in facilities for the mentally ill. He continued to speak of the Villisca murders until the end, sometimes claiming innocence, sometimes hinting at knowledge of the crime, his words too confused and contradictory to offer any real illumination. He died in 1933, taking whatever truth he knew to his grave. Chapter 8. Trials and Acquittals. The acquittal of George Kelly did not end the legal proceedings related to the Villisca murders. The case had become too prominent, the public demand for justice too strong, for the authorities to simply abandon their efforts. Within months of Kelly's acquittal, the prosecution announced that he would be tried again, this time in a different jurisdiction, where they believed they could obtain a conviction. Double jeopardy did not apply in the way it would in later decades. The legal system of the time allowed for retrials under certain circumstances, and the prosecutors were determined to use every tool available to them. The second trial of George Kelly began in early 1918. The venue was changed to another county, the hope being that a different jury might view the evidence differently. The case presented was essentially the same as before. Kelly had been in Villisca at the time of the murders. He had left town under suspicious circumstances. His subsequent behaviour had been incriminating. His statements suggested knowledge of details that only the killer would know. The prosecution brought forward the same witnesses, introduced the same evidence, made the same arguments that had failed to convince the first jury. The defence mounted the same vigorous response. The evidence was circumstantial. The witnesses were unreliable. Kelly's behaviour was the result of mental illness, not guilt. No physical evidence connected him to the crime scene. The defence attorneys were even more aggressive in this second trial, attacking the credibility of prosecution witnesses and challenging every piece of evidence introduced. They portrayed the renewed prosecution as persecution, a vindictive attempt to convict an innocent man simply because the authorities needed someone to blame for the unsolved murders. The second jury deliberated longer than the first, suggesting they were more divided in their assessment of Kelly's guilt. But after 3 days of discussion, they too returned a verdict of not guilty. Kelly was acquitted a second time. The prosecution accepted defeat. There would be no third trial. George Kelly, whatever the truth of his involvement in the Villisca murders, would never be convicted of the crime. The case against him was closed, the legal system having spoken twice in his favour. But Kelly was not the only person to face charges related to the murders. In 1916, while Kelly was still awaiting his first trial, authorities had arrested William Mansfield, the man who worked for Frank Jones. The case against Mansfield was different from that against Kelly. Where Kelly had been charged based on his presence in Villisca and his subsequent suspicious behaviour, Mansfield was charged based on a theory that he had been hired to commit the murders, that he was a professional killer employed by Jones to eliminate a business rival. The evidence against Mansfield was even weaker than that against Kelly. No witnesses placed him at the Moore house on the night of the murders. His alibi, while imperfect, could not be definitively disproven. The prosecution's case rested largely on establishing that he had the temperament for violence and the need for money that might make him willing to commit murder for hire. They introduced evidence of his previous arrests for assault and battery, his reputation as a dangerous man when drunk, his financial difficulties that might have made him susceptible to an offer of payment for killing. But temperament is not proof of specific action. A man might be violent by nature and yet not be a murderer. The jury in Mansfield's trial, held in late 1916, heard testimony about his character and his possible motives, but they heard nothing that definitively connected him to the crime scene. The prosecution attempted to show that Mansfield had access to a horse and buggy that would have allowed him to travel to Villisca on the night in question, but they could not prove that he had actually made such a journey. After brief deliberation, the jury acquitted Mansfield of all charges. Frank Jones was never formally charged with any crime related to the murders, despite the persistent rumours and theories that linked him to the killings. The evidence against him was even more tenuous than that against Mansfield. He had an alibi for the night of the murders, corroborated by his wife. He was a man of standing and influence, a state senator, not someone who could easily be accused of such a heinous crime without ironclad proof. The authorities investigated him thoroughly, examining his financial records for evidence of payments to Mansfield or other hired killers. But they found nothing incriminating. The theory that Jones had orchestrated the murders never entirely disappeared. Some people in Villisca and the surrounding area remained convinced that he was responsible, that his business rivalry with Josiah Moore had motivated him to commit or commission the crime. But belief is not evidence, and suspicion is not proof. Jones lived out his remaining years under a cloud of speculation but free from legal consequences. He maintained his innocence until his death, insisting that he had played no role in the murders and that those who accused him were motivated by envy of his success and political position. The failure to convict anyone of the Villisca murders left a wound in the community that never fully healed. Justice had not been served. 8 people had been murdered in their beds, and no one had been held accountable. The legal system had examined multiple suspects, conducted 2 major trials and several smaller proceedings, and had come up empty. The prosecutors had done their best with the evidence available to them, but that evidence had proven insufficient to convince juries beyond a reasonable doubt. The standard of proof required in criminal cases was high, deliberately so designed to prevent the conviction of innocent people. But this high standard also meant that guilty people sometimes went free when the evidence against them was circumstantial or ambiguous. The Villisca case appeared to be such an instance. Most people believed that one of the men who had been tried, either Kelly or Mansfield, was guilty of the murders, but belief was not enough. The law required proof, and proof had not been forthcoming. As the legal proceedings wound down and the last appeals were exhausted, attention turned to other possible explanations for the crime. If Kelly, Mansfield and Jones were all innocent, as the juries had concluded, then who had committed the murders? The question hung over Villisca like a dark cloud, unanswered and seemingly unanswerable. Some believed the killer had been a transient, someone passing through town who had struck without warning and then vanished into the vastness of America. Others thought the murderer might have been a local person, someone known to the community, who had managed to conceal his guilt through careful silence and the absence of physical evidence. The theory that the Villisca murders were part of a larger pattern of similar crimes gained renewed attention. Investigators compiled lists of axe murders that had occurred across the Midwest in the years before and after 1912. The similarities were striking. Families killed in their beds while sleeping. The weapon always an axe, usually taken from the victim's own property. The violence always extreme and excessive. The lack of clear motive in most cases. The absence of witnesses or physical evidence that might identify the killer. If these crimes were indeed connected, if they were the work of a single individual or perhaps a small group working together, then that person or persons had killed dozens of people across multiple states over a period of years. The thought was almost incomprehensible. Serial murder was not unknown in history, but the scale and duration of such a killing spree would be unprecedented. And the fact that the killer or killers had never been caught, had never made a mistake significant enough to lead to their identification, suggested a level of cunning and self-control that made them all the more terrifying. Some investigators attempted to create a profile of this hypothetical killer. He would have been a man, almost certainly, given the physical strength required to wield an axe with such devastating effect. He would have been transient, moving from place to place, perhaps working as a travelling salesman or itinerant labourer. He would have appeared normal to those who encountered him, capable of blending into communities without arousing suspicion. He would have selected his victims according to some internal logic, some pattern that made sense to him but remained invisible to others. But profiles are theoretical constructs, useful for organising thoughts but insufficient for solving crimes. Without hard evidence, without witnesses or physical connections to specific crimes, the profile of a hypothetical serial killer was nothing more than speculation. The investigators who believed in this theory pursued it as far as they could, attempting to track individuals who had been present in multiple towns where axe murders had occurred. But the difficulties were immense. Record keeping was inconsistent. People moved freely without documenting their travel. Memories faded with time. The trail, if it had ever existed, grew cold. By 1920, 8 years after the murders, the active investigation had effectively ceased. The files remained open, technically unsolved cases that could be reopened if new evidence emerged. But no new evidence did emerge. The people who had been questioned had told everything they knew, or everything they were willing to tell. The physical evidence had been examined and re-examined without yielding any breakthrough. The legal system had tried the most promising suspects and found them not guilty. There was nothing left to do but accept that the Villisca murders would likely never be solved. The failure to bring anyone to justice had profound effects on the town and on American society more broadly. Villisca became synonymous with unsolved horror, a cautionary tale about the limits of law enforcement and the persistence of evil. The case was studied by criminologists and law enforcement officials, becoming an example of how difficult it could be to solve certain types of crimes, especially in an era before modern forensic techniques. The murders also contributed to a growing awareness that the country harboured dangers that had previously been unrecognised or ignored. The early 20th century was a time of transition in America. The frontier was closing. Railroads connected even remote towns to the wider world. People moved with increasing frequency and freedom, no longer tied to the land or communities of their birth. This mobility created opportunities but also risks. A man could commit a crime in one town and disappear into another state before authorities even knew to look for him. The anonymity of modern life, which brought freedom from the constraints of small-town existence, also provided cover for those who meant harm. The Villisca murders exposed these new vulnerabilities. A family could lock their doors and still be murdered in their beds. A killer could strike without warning and escape without detection. The tools of law enforcement, adequate for dealing with local criminals known to the community, proved insufficient for tracking transient killers who left few traces and no clear motives. The case revealed the need for better coordination between law enforcement agencies in different jurisdictions, for improved enforcement of forensic techniques, for new approaches to investigating crimes that crossed county and state boundaries. But these lessons came too late for the Moore family and the Stillinger sisters. They remained in their graves in the Villisca cemetery, their murders unavenged, their killer unknown. The community erected monuments to their memory, simple stones that recorded names and dates but could not explain why they had died or who had taken their lives. Visitors to the cemetery in later years would stand before these graves and wonder about the story behind the names, about the terror of that June night and the decades of frustrated investigation that followed. Chapter 9. The Other Murders. The Villisca massacre did not occur in isolation. In the years surrounding June of 1912, a pattern of similar murders spread across the American Midwest like a dark stain, each crime bearing unmistakable similarities to the others. Families were killed in their beds while they slept. The weapon was always an axe or similar bladed instrument. The violence was always excessive. Victims were receiving far more blows than necessary to kill them. Mirrors were sometimes covered. Windows were draped. The killer or killers vanished without leaving witnesses or clear evidence of identity. The question that haunted investigators was whether these crimes were the work of one person, moving through the heartland with terrible purpose, or whether they were separate tragedies that happened to share certain characteristics. The first of these murders that bore resemblance to the Villisca killings occurred in Colorado Springs, Colorado. In September of 1911, the Wayne family, consisting of a husband, wife, and their young daughter, were found dead in their home, killed with an axe while they slept. The scene bore all the hallmarks that would later be associated with the pattern. Excessive violence, covered windows, the axe left at the scene. No clear motive, no suspects. The local authorities investigated but made no arrests. The crime remained unsolved, filed away as one of those tragedies that occasionally occur without explanation. Less than 2 weeks after the Wayne murders, another family was killed in Monmouth, Illinois. William Dawson, his wife, and their 2 children were found dead in their beds, their heads crushed by an axe. The killer had entered through an unlocked door or window, moved through the house systematically, and departed without being seen. Neighbours had heard nothing during the night. The discovery came in the morning when Dawson failed to appear at his place of employment and colleagues went to check on him. The scene was horrific. The entire family had been slaughtered. The investigation yielded no useful leads. In October of 1911, Ellsworth, Kansas experienced its own axe murder. A family of 3 was killed in circumstances nearly identical to those in Colorado Springs and Monmouth. The victims were found in their beds, struck repeatedly with an axe taken from their own woodpile. Windows had been covered. The killer had spent time in the house after the murders, smoking cigarettes and perhaps washing at the kitchen pump. Then he had vanished into the darkness, leaving no trace that would lead investigators to his identity. Then came Villisca in June of 1912, the most notorious of all these crimes because of the number of victims and the ages of the children killed. 8 people murdered in a single night, including 4 young children and 2 visiting girls. The brutality shocked the nation in a way that the earlier murders had not. Villisca became the name associated with this pattern of killings, the case that drew the most attention and the most intensive investigation, even though it was neither the first nor the last of the series. In September of 1912, just 3 months after Villisca, another family was murdered in their beds in Monmouth, Illinois. The Pfanschmidt family, consisting of 4 people, were killed with an axe in circumstances that mirrored the earlier crimes. The house was subsequently burned, perhaps in an attempt to destroy evidence or perhaps as part of the killer's ritual. Unlike the other cases, this one resulted in an arrest and conviction. Ray Pfanschmidt, the son of 2 of the victims, was charged with the murders and eventually found guilty. He maintained his innocence throughout his trial and imprisonment, but the courts concluded he was responsible for his family's death. The Pfanschmidt case raised questions about whether all the axe murders were actually connected. If Ray Pfanschmidt had killed his own family, and if the circumstances bore similarities to the other crimes, did that mean all the murders were copycat killings, separate crimes inspired by newspaper coverage of previous attacks? Or had Pfanschmidt been wrongly convicted? Another victim of a frustrated justice system desperate to solve at least one of these horrible crimes? The questions could not be definitively answered, but they complicated efforts to determine whether a single killer was responsible for the pattern. In June of 1912, the same month as the Villisca murders but in a different location, another axe killing occurred. The timing suggested it could not have been committed by the same person unless the killer had travelled with impossible speed between crime scenes. But the similarities were present nonetheless. A family killed in their beds, an axe as the weapon, excessive violence. The question became whether there might be 2 killers operating according to similar methods, or whether some of these crimes were indeed unrelated despite their surface similarities. In December of 1912, Bonnie and Clyde Hollingsworth were murdered in their home in Houston Heights, Texas. The weapon was not an axe, but a similar bladed instrument. The victims were struck repeatedly while they slept. The crime bore enough similarity to the pattern that some investigators believed it might be connected, though others argued that the geographic distance from the other murders made this unlikely. The Houston crime was never solved, adding one more unsolved axe murder to the growing list. Through 1913 and 1914, additional murders occurred that might or might not have been part of the pattern. In some cases, the details matched closely. In others, there were significant differences that argued against connection. The difficulty was that many of these crimes occurred in different jurisdictions, investigated by different law enforcement agencies with limited communication between them. No central database existed where information about similar crimes could be compiled and compared. Each local authority worked on its own cases, often unaware of similar murders in other states. Investigators who became aware of the pattern attempted to track individuals who might have been present in multiple locations where murders occurred. Travelling salesmen were of particular interest as they moved regularly from town to town and often stayed in local hotels or boarding houses where their presence might have been recorded, but the number of such individuals was vast, and most maintained only imperfect records of their travels. Confirming that a particular person had been in Colorado Springs in September of 1911, Villisca in June of 1912, and Houston in December of 1912 proved nearly impossible. Railroad records were examined in an attempt to track passengers who had travelled between towns where murders occurred around the times the crimes were committed. But thousands of people travelled by rail each day. The railroads kept records of ticket sales, but not always of individual passengers. A person could board a train in one town and disembark in another without creating any record that would allow investigators to identify them months or years later. The anonymity of modern transportation provided cover for anyone who wished to move about without detection. One individual who drew significant attention was a man known only as the Man from the Train. This nickname was applied retrospectively by researchers who attempted to link dozens of unsolved axe murders across the country to a single perpetrator. The theory held that this individual travelled by rail, hopping freight cars when necessary, moving from place to place without establishing residence anywhere. He would arrive in a town, select a house near the railroad tracks, observe the family that lived there, and then strike when opportunity presented itself. After the murder, he would return to the rails and move on to the next town, the next victims. The Man from the Train theory attempted to explain not only the Midwest murders, but similar crimes across the entire country over a period of more than a decade. The proponents of this theory identified common characteristics across dozens of cases. Homes located near railroad tracks, families killed with an axe or similar bladed weapon, excessive violence suggesting rage or psychological disturbance, covered windows and mirrors, the killer spending time at the scene after the murders. If the theory was correct, the individual responsible might have killed more than 100 people between 1900 and 1912, making him one of the most prolific serial killers in American history. But the theory remained speculative, built on pattern recognition rather than hard evidence. No physical evidence linked the various crimes to a single perpetrator. No witness had ever provided a description of the killer that could be confirmed across multiple cases. The similarities between the crimes might indicate a single perpetrator, or they might simply reflect the fact that certain methods of murder are more common than others. Breaking into a house at night, using a readily available weapon like an axe, killing sleeping victims to minimize resistance, these were not unique approaches to murder. Multiple killers operating independently might employ similar methods without there being any connection between them. The difficulty in determining whether the crimes were connected frustrated both investigators and the families of victims. If there was a single killer, then all these deaths were the work of one man, and finding him would bring justice for dozens of families. But if the crimes were unrelated, then dozens of separate killers had committed individual murders and escaped justice. Thought even more disturbing in its implications about the prevalence of such evil. The question could not be definitively resolved with the evidence and investigative techniques available in the early 20th century. As the years passed and no new murders clearly fitting the pattern occurred, some theorized that the killer had died, been imprisoned for another crime, or simply stopped killing. Serial killers, to the limited extent they were understood at the time, were thought to be driven by compulsions they could not resist. If the murders stopped, it might mean the compulsion had been satisfied, or the killer had found another outlet for his urges, or he was no longer capable of acting on them. But without knowing who the killer was, these theories could not be tested or confirmed. The families of the victims in Villisca and the other towns where these murders occurred lived with questions that could never be answered. They buried their dead and tried to rebuild their lives, but the shadow of uncertainty followed them. Who had killed their loved ones? Why had they been targeted? Would the killer strike again, perhaps attacking other members of their families? The fear was pervasive and lasting, changing the way people lived, making them more cautious, more suspicious, less trusting of strangers and darkness. The pattern of axe murders became part of American folklore, a dark chapter in the nation's history that was discussed in hushed tones and used to frighten children into obedience. The story of families killed in their beds while sleeping became a cautionary tale, a reminder that safety was never guaranteed and that evil could strike anywhere, even in the peaceful heartland where such things were not supposed to happen. The murders challenged the American self-image as the safe and civilized nation, revealing that beneath the surface of order and prosperity lurked dangers that the authorities could not always control or eliminate. By the 1920s, the pattern had apparently ceased. No new murders clearly fitting the established characteristics occurred, or if they did, they were not recognized as being part of the earlier pattern. The investigation into the connected crimes wound down, the files stored away in basements and archives, the cases remaining technically open but effectively abandoned. The families of the victim held their memories and their grief. The towns where the murders had occurred slowly healed, though they never forgot. And somewhere, whether in a grave or still walking among the living, the person or persons responsible for these crimes remained unknown, their secrets carried into silence and shadow. Chapter 10. The House Remembers. The White House on 2nd Street in Villisca stood empty for many years after the murders. No one wanted to live in a place where such horror had occurred. The floors still bore stains that could not be fully removed. The walls remembered the violence they had witnessed. The rooms held an atmosphere that people found oppressive and disturbing, as if the terror of that June night had soaked into the very structure of the building, becoming part of its substance in ways that could be felt but not explained. In the immediate aftermath of the murders and the failed trials, the Moore House became a burden to those who inherited it. Family members could not bring themselves to live there or to sell it to anyone who might make it a home again. The building fell into disrepair, its paint peeling, its shutters hanging crooked, its yard growing wild with weeds and neglect. Children walking to school took the long way around to avoid passing it. Adults crossed to the other side of the street rather than walk directly in front of the property. The house became a place of avoidance, marked by tragedy in ways that made it untouchable. Occasionally, curiosity seekers would attempt to enter the abandoned structure. They would force windows or pry at doors, seeking to stand in the rooms where the murders had occurred, to see for themselves the scene of such notorious crime. Some came with cameras, hoping to capture images they could show to friends or sell to newspapers. Others came seeking souvenirs, pieces of the house that they could take away as morbid trophies. The property had to be periodically secured and patrolled to keep out these intruders, though the resources devoted to such protection were minimal, and the house was frequently breached. Stories began to circulate that the house was haunted. People claimed to see lights in the windows at night when the building was known to be empty. Sounds were reported, voices and footsteps and the echoes of violence. These reports followed the predictable pattern of ghost stories, each telling embellishing the details, adding new elements with each retelling. Whether any of these accounts had basis in actual experience or whether they were simply the product of imagination working on a place already associated with death and fear was impossible to determine. But the stories persisted, growing more elaborate with each passing year. In the 1920s and 30s, as the immediate memory of the murders began to fade, and a new generation came of age with no direct connection to the victims, the house's reputation shifted slightly. It became less a place of genuine terror and more a local legend. a dark attraction that gave Villisca a claim to historical significance, however grim that significance might be. Historians began to take interest in the case, writing articles and eventually books about the unsolved murders, keeping the story alive in ways that transcended the local community. During the Great Depression, when people had little money and fewer resources, the house continued to stand empty. No one could afford to purchase and restore it, even if they had been willing to overlook its history. The building deteriorated further, its roof developing leaks, its foundation settling unevenly, its interior falling into decay. Rain came through the broken windows. Animals nested in the abandoned rooms. The structure seemed to be slowly collapsing in on itself, as if the weight of what had happened within its walls was physically crushing it over time. World War II brought changes to Villisca as it did to all of America. Young men left for military service. The economy shifted to support the war effort. The murders of 1912 seemed to belong to a different era, a time before the world had been transformed by global conflict and technological change. The house on 2nd Street remained, a relic of that earlier age, its significance diminished by events of much greater magnitude. But it did not disappear. It persisted, maintained in its state of decay by the simple fact that no one knew what else to do with it. In the decades after the war, as America entered a period of prosperity and suburban expansion, Villisca remained a small farming town, bypassed by the major developments reshaping the country. The house on 2nd Street stood as it had stood for decades, empty and deteriorating, a monument to an unsolved crime from a vanishing past. Occasionally journalists would revisit the story, publishing anniversary articles about the murders and the failed investigation. These articles would briefly revive interest in the case, bringing a new wave of curious visitors to the town, but the attention would fade quickly and Villisca would return to its quiet obscurity. By the 1970s and 80s, true crime was becoming a popular genre in American culture. Books and television programs about famous murders found large audiences. The Villisca Axe Murders, with their combination of multiple victims, child deaths, and unsolved mystery, became a subject of renewed interest. Authors researched the case, interviewing descendants of those involved, examining old records, attempting to solve a crime that was now more than 60 years old. New theories were proposed, old suspects were reconsidered, but no definitive answer emerged. The case remained as mysterious as ever. In 1994, more than 80 years after the murders, the house on 2nd Street was purchased by a couple who intended to restore it and preserve it as a historical site. The decision was controversial in Villisca. Some residents felt the house should be torn down, that it served no good purpose to maintain a monument to such tragedy. Others argued that the building was part of the town's history, however dark that history might be, and that preserving it served an educational function. The debate reflected broader questions about how communities should remember their darkest moments, and what responsibility they have to future generations to maintain honest accounting of the past. The restoration took years. The building had been allowed to decay for so long that much of it had to be rebuilt, but the new owners worked carefully to maintain historical accuracy, consulting photographs from 1912, studying the floor plans that had been documented during the investigation, attempting to recreate the house as it had been on the night of the murders. When the work was completed, the Moore house looked much as it had looked when Josiah and Sarah and their children had lived there. A modest 2-story home appropriate to a middle-class family in a small Iowa town in the early 20th century. The house opened to the public as a museum and historical site. Visitors could tour the rooms where the murders had occurred, see the bedrooms where the victims had slept, stand in the spaces where the killer had moved with such terrible purpose. The tours were somber affairs, guides recounting the basic facts of the crime, the failed investigation, the various theories about who might have been responsible. No attempt was made to sensationalize or exploit the tragedy, but neither was there any way to entirely escape the macabre nature of what was being presented. People came to see the site of a famous unsolved murder, and that was what they were shown. The house also began to attract paranormal investigators, people who believed they could communicate with the dead or detect the presence of spirits, They came with their electronic equipment and their theories about residual energy and traumatic imprints. They spent nights in the house, recording sounds and taking photographs, claiming to detect the presence of the Moore family or the Stillinger sisters. These investigations became popular subjects for television programs devoted to the supernatural, bringing a different kind of attention to the house and to Villisca. Whether one believed in ghosts or not, there was something undeniably heavy about the atmosphere in the house on 2nd Street. Visitors often remarked on the feeling of sadness that permeated the rooms, a sense of sorrow and loss that went beyond what could be explained by simple knowledge of the building's history. Perhaps it was psychological, the mind creating emotions appropriate to a place associated with tragedy. Or perhaps something of the terror and grief of that June night had indeed remained, bound to the location in ways that defied rational explanation. Each visitor had to decide for themselves what they felt and what it meant. The preservation of the house ensured that the story of the Villisca murders would not be forgotten. New generations learned about the crime, studied the evidence, debated the various theories about who had committed it. The case became a subject for podcasts and documentaries, reaching audiences far beyond Iowa, becoming part of the national consciousness in ways that would have been impossible to predict when the murders first occurred. The 8 victims, dead for more than a century, were remembered and mourned by people who had no connection to them, except through the story of their deaths. The mystery remained unsolved. All the people who might have had direct knowledge of what happened that night were long dead. Josiah and Sarah Moore, Herman and Catherine and Boyd and Paul Moore, Lena and Ina Stillinger. They had taken the truth with them into their graves. George Kelly, William Mansfield, Frank Jones. All the suspects and witnesses, they too had died without providing the final answer. The axe used in the murders had long since been lost or destroyed. The physical evidence had deteriorated or disappeared. Only the house remained, silent and knowing, keeping its secrets. On quiet nights in Villisca, when the streets were empty and the modern world seemed far away, it was possible to imagine June 10th, 1912. To picture the Moore family walking home from the church program, the children tired but happy, Lena and Ina Stillinger excited about their overnight stay. To see them entering the house, Sarah lighting lamps, Josiah checking the doors, to follow them upstairs to their bedrooms, watch them settle into sleep, innocent and unsuspecting, and then to imagine that other presence entering the house, moving through the darkness with the axe in hand, climbing the stairs with murderous intent. But imagination could only go so far. The actual events of that night, the specific details of who and why and how, remained beyond reach. The house could show visitors where the victims had slept and where they had died. It could display the layout that the killer had navigated, and the rooms where he had performed his strange post-murder rituals, but it could not answer the questions that mattered most. It could not identify the person who had destroyed 8 lives in a few hours of darkness. It could not explain what motivation had driven someone to commit such horror. It could only stand as it had stood for more than a century, a white house on a quiet street, marked forever by the blood that had been spilled within its walls. The town of Villisca continued its existence around the house, no longer defined entirely by the murders but never quite able to escape their shadow. New families moved in. Children were born and grew up, businesses opened and closed. The rhythms of small-town life continued as they always had, generation following generation. But the house on 2nd Street remained constant, a reminder that some questions have no answers, that some crimes cannot be solved, that some darkness persists no matter how much time passes or how desperately people seek the light. And so the story ends where it began, with the house standing silent in the Iowa night. Inside, the rooms are empty now, furnished only with period-appropriate pieces that approximate what the Moores might have owned. The beds are made, but no one sleeps in them. The floors are clean, but they remember the blood that once soaked them. The walls have been painted, but they cannot forget what they witnessed. The house remembers everything and reveals nothing, keeping its vigil over a mystery that has endured for more than 100 years and will likely endure for as long as the structure itself remains standing. The candle burned low, the chamber fell silent, and history once again turned the page in the dark.